Hello, everyone, and welcome to the UnheraldedView.com's The Run-A-Round. Today, on installment 4 of this audio series, we will focus on an NHL topic, with the topic being trying to solve the unfortunate puzzle that is again the struggling Buffalo Sabres, discussing what factors have ailed the Sabres throughout the season, analyzing the improvement in their play since their coaching change, while then concluding by coming up with solutions to get the franchise steered in the right direction. All that and more is coming up on installment 4 of the Run-A-Round series. "15, 33, and 7. I'm sorry, Buffalo Sabres fans, but I have to repeat that again. 15, 33, and 7 was the record your team had this past season. That equates to 37 points and a .336 point percentage, all good for last in the league in basically all categories. So that means the Buffalo Sabres were the worst team in the NHL. It's a sad fact to say once again for such a great fan base, but that's where they sat. And the numbers really don't lie. It's not like they're deceiving in any way. The numbers truly depict why they were the worst team in the league by far. Let's just start with some of the offensive numbers. We look at goals per game. This number actually came up from being dead last early on. They finished 26th in the NHL with a 2.44 goals for per game. And then when you look at it, it's interesting that they struggle so much to score goals when their power play was actually a little bit above average. They were at 21.13% on the power play, where league average is around 20.06. So the power play was definitely a bright spot for the team this year. When you look at the goals for, though, they only scored 134 goals, where league average was about 159 scored in total by an NHL team. That's a minus 25 differential. So they scored 25 goals fewer than basically any other team in the NHL this season, which is mind-boggling in a way that is that wide of a discrepancy. But it makes sense when you look at their 8.4% shooting percentage when the league on average shot almost 10%. That means they didn't have a whole lot of luck and they didn't have a whole lot of guys that were capable of putting the puck in the net on a consistent basis to make this team any type of capable offensively or dangerous on most nights. Moving on to the defensive side, they were, as you guessed it, dead last in goals per game at 3.56, 31st in the league. But again, specialty teams continue to be a bright spot because their penalty kill really wasn't that bad. You would think for a team that struggles that much defensively, the lack of a penalty kill will really hurt them, but league average about 79.94%, so a touch under 80%. They were at 77.37%, which is, again, not terrible and not the wide discrepancy you would think for a team that struggles so much keeping the puck out of the back of their net. But then when you look at it overall and their goals allowed, they gave up 196 goals this year, whereas on average only about 159 were given up by an NHL team this season. I mean, that's again a wide discrepancy, almost a plus 20 differential in terms of more goals given up than the next team. I mean, that is just insane to think about. Or actually, that's more than plus 20. My math's a little bit off. But you just think about that discrepancy. I mean, they really struggle to keep the puck out of their net. And it shows because on the third level of their team, the goaltending wasn't very good. The save percentage for their club, 5-on-5, was .915, where league average was .922. And when you look at their overall team save percentage, it was only .896, where the league average was a little over 900 at .904. So their goaltending was really below average this year, and that was despite the play of one young man who really made a name for himself that we'll get to in just a bit. Now, to go a little bit deeper in terms of the team leaders and who was really the catalyst to lead this team, unfortunately, to this atrocious record this year, some of this can be considered as bright spots, but others just show just how much this team really struggled. Sam Reinhart led them with 25 goals this year, so it was another really good season for Sam Reinhart, who's a young forward for them. But again, when you look at it, he was one of a very few guys that actually scored double digits. In fact, he was one of only 3 guys who actually made it to the double-digit goal mark this season. And it was a wide discrepancy, in fact, a number we'll get to it later as well. I mean, that doesn't say very much, but it showed that he really stepped up his game and did play well and better in the second half of the season after the coaching change. In terms of assists, Victor Olofsson led them with 19. He had himself, I think, a solid second full season with the big club, but still a lot to be desired on his end as well. And Reinhart led them with 40 points overall again, so Sam Reinhart led them in goals and points. But when you get to their plus-minus leaders, now as I will tell you, plus-minus is not the end-all be-all when it comes to telling a player's worth and the positive impact he has on the ice. But when the guy with the best plus-minus on your team is Kyle Oposo at -1, That's not very good because then when you compare that to the worst plus minus on the team, which was young defenseman Rasmus Dahlin, who was a minus 36, that is a wide gap in terms of who was by far the most impactful player negatively. But then they didn't have a single player, at least that qualified in the plus minus category, that finished even this year, which tells you there was really not a lot of positive hockey being played, unfortunately, by the Buffalo Sabres. Now, again, I say take plus minus stats with a grain of salt, but in this case, I don't think it's anything less telling that the Buffalo Sabres, a lot of their players really just had really bad seasons. But again, here's the one bright spot I mentioned. Goaltending, especially from Linus Ullmark, was actually a bright spot personally for him. He had a 917 save percentage to lead the club's goaltending group and a 2.63 goals against average. And I say lead their goaltending group because of all the injuries they had to play 6 different netminders, and that's injuries including him missing just about almost 2 months worth of time with the injuries he had to deal with. So he had actually a pretty good year, and he's going to be a UFA, so he's going to be asking for some new money, as I like to say. And then to wrap it all up, their ice time leader was Rasmus Ristolainen, who's kind of become a veteran at this point, even though still around his early to mid-20s. He led them at 22 minutes and 17 seconds per game. So what do all those stats kind of say to you? It just paints the picture that the Buffalo Sabres just weren't a very good hockey team at any level of the sport. Now, there is room to certainly improve, but if we're really going to discuss how this team can improve all these numbers and make sure when we have hopefully a nice full season next year, how do they make sure they're not right at the bottom of the league standings once again? And the first way we have to do that is that we have to really attack the main issues that plagued them this season, determine what were the main causes and factors for these issues. So I think that's the next best place to start. Now, in terms of the main issues to tackle that I just mentioned, I think I was able to break them down really into 4 key categories. And the first one I decided to delve into was the lack of scoring ability and scoring depth on this club this past season. Like I mentioned earlier when introducing some of the stats, the Buffalo Sabres only had 3 double-digit goal scorers this year. They had the aforementioned Reinhart, who led them with 25. Victor Olofsson, who led them in assists with 19, was second on the team in goals with 13. And then their third highest guy was Casey Mittelstadt, who had a grand whopping total of 10. And he got 6 of those down basically the last month and a half of the season, so he had to get really hot late just to reach double digits himself. And when you look at them overall, their top 6 point scorers combined for just 60 goals. And when you compare that to a team, say, like the Devils, who finished just ahead of them as second to last in the East Division this year, their top 6 scorers combined for 78 goals. So you're talking about between the 2 bottom teams in their own division, Sabres, still managed to finish with 18 fewer goals than the second worst team in the same division that they play in. Now, that's not a very good sign and tells you again, it further validates why offensively they were one of the worst teams in the National Hockey League. And when you take a look at it overall, it wasn't just the fact that they weren't scoring, but the depth score that's so important in the game of hockey because you can't just solely rely on stars no matter how talented those stars may be. And you look at some of the key guys I just decided to write down here. Kyle Oposo, a veteran who got they're hoping can provide some scoring in the bottom 6, is on a big contract, had just 2 goals. Tobias Reeder, who they signed, had 5 goals. Riley Sheahan, another veteran who's had success at other destinations, he had just 4 goals. So you're looking at basically getting virtually nothing from your bottom 6, while your top 6 is also struggling to score goals. That's how you ultimately end up with only 3 double-digit goal scorers and in the bottom 5th of the league in terms of scoring overall. Now, the second major issue that contributed to them having such an awful season was the injuries. We got to be honest. It's not an excuse. The Buffalo Sabres dealt with injuries, and not just injuries to any old player, to really key guys in their lineup. They lost their number 1 center and superstar leader and captain Jack Eichel to some major injuries, whether it was an ankle or a neck injury that was really serious for him. I mean, when you don't have your number 1 guy, offense is going to be a big issue. And the fact that he only scored 2 goals this year before he ultimately had to shut it down because of all the injuries was very telling just about how down of a season a player of his caliber really had, and overall how poor of a year it was for the Sabres as a whole. They had injuries to both their top 2 goaltenders and Linus Ullmark, who had the breakout season, and despite missing significant time, still ended up with a 9-6-3 record overall. They lost his backup Carter Hutton, and that's the reason why they ended up, as I mentioned earlier, playing 6 different goalies by season's end. They lost one of their top 6 defensemen in Jake McCabe, who is due to be a free agent summer, so they have some big decisions to make with him. And they lost forwards rookie Dylan Cousins, who they brought in. We're excited to see what he could do. And even Kyle Oposo, one of the guys they're hoping for depth, was once again dealing with injuries, which hurt his season as well. So again, it's not an excuse for this team. It's just a fact that injuries really hobbled them for a team that already was kind of on the fringe of were they going to be good or not good. But I think the injuries certainly just escalated everything in terms of them not playing well and not having any of their quality players or enough quality players in the lineup on a consistent basis to be able to compete and try to right some of the wrongs they had been dealing with as the season went along. Now, the fourth thing I mentioned in terms of their main issues that I was able to observe from the numbers and watching a few of their games this year was just the underperformance of their overall stars and some of their big money players. Jack Eichel, who's really their franchise player, was lost to injury and, as I mentioned, scored just 2 goals before that, so was really having a bad season. Jeff Skinner, who they signed to a big-time contract a couple of years ago, and that contract looks like it's falling flat on its face. He had just 7 goals this year, was a minus 11, and ended up playing many a time this year on their 4th line. So when you're paying a guy north of superstar money for 7 goals and a minus 11 rating, I mean, that ain't going to cut it. And then you even look back on their defense, where the names are some pretty talented defensemen. You have Rasmus Ristolainen, Rasmus Dahlin, Brandon Montour, who they eventually traded off during the trade deadline, and then Colin Miller, who they acquired, the former Vegas Golden Knight, who was such a fixture for them on the back end. Well, you look at their plus minuses. Dahlin was a minus 36, obviously to lead the club in terms of worst plus minus. Ristolainen wasn't much better at minus 18. Colin Miller, who they acquired, was a minus 20, and Montour was minus 13 before they traded him. So defensively, they really did not get enough and really got a lot of poor play from their back end, which led not only to their offense struggling, but also to their defense obviously struggling with those last lines of defense before you reach the netminder. And then the fourth and final thing that really contributed to their downfall, I think, was just the losing culture and the poor coaching and management decisions that the franchise overall made. Now, again, I will say I'm not connected in the building, but it's pretty easy to see from the outside, just observing, keeping track of all the news that comes out, that this team just is right now in a rut in terms of how they want to run and what they really want to be as an organization. Not only did they basically get into the record books with a 18 games in a row losing streak consecutively this season, but then you had all these talks of players that wanted to and then ultimately ended up getting traded. Players like Taylor Hall, who now, funny enough, are in the postseason playing for the Boston Bruins. Brandon Montour was traded to the Panthers. Now he's in the postseason. Eric Stahl, Montreal in the postseason. Curtis Lazar, Bruins in the postseason. You get my point. So they all got their wish. But to have that kind of upheaval, especially while the season's going on, and even before the trade deadline was upon them, really tells you just how much of a losing culture they were kind of building and have continued to fester within that organization. Plus, it doesn't help when you fire your entire scouting staff with a rookie GM in place, and you made, unfortunately, by the numbers, what looked like a poor coaching hire in Ralph Kruger, who had a 6-18-4 record before they finally sent him out the back door, and then bring in interim coach Don Granato, who, while he was an improvement, was still just 9-16-3 overall with the team. So, I mean, again, there's just a lot of things organizationally and within the underbelly of this team that just also contributed the reason why they weren't able to build any type of consistent stability and a winning culture in this organization to try to move forward with. But that does not mean there's not solutions that can't be found with this club to get them back on the right track and back to the glory days, as many Buffalo Sabres fans will be happy to relish in, especially now with where the team has been the past decade. So I say now's a good time to start discussing what are some of the solutions, and I came up with actually a couple of them. So here are just a couple of the solutions that, after a lot of deliberating amongst myself, obviously, I was able to come up for the Buffalo Sabres. The first thing is pretty simple. They just got to make a good coaching hire. I don't think, unfortunately, they're going to stick with Don Granato, their interim coach, as the coach going forward, which means there are a lot of really good candidates out there. Obviously, the big 3 names that have been thrown out there have been guys like Boudreau, Gerard, Gallant, and John Stevens. Boudreau and Gallant, who have both had success with multiple franchises, leading multiple franchises to the postseason, and even for Gallant, leading a team to the Stanley Cup Finals in Vegas with his very first year of the franchise. So, I mean, you've got a lot of success, and I mean, don't forget about Bruce Boudreau really ushering in the Rock the Red era in Washington and helping develop guys like Nicholas Backstrom, Alex Ovechkin, Mike Green, players of that nature. And then John Stevens, who's a longtime NHL great and now in the coaching ranks. So they got to make a good coaching hire so they can really get everything set in terms of how they want their young players to develop and how they want to really put a team together under this new coaching regime, which leads into the next standpoint of in terms of solutions. They got to start drafting solidly and have just better overall player development. Now it's going to be interesting to see how they go about that, being that, as I mentioned earlier, they fired their entire scouting staff and they're working with a rookie GM. But again, when you have young players in your system currently that are already at the NHL level, like Dylan Cousins, Casey Middlestad, Rasmus Dahlin, and then Rasmus Asplund, my apologies, and Arturo Ruistalainen, who both made their appearances this year and had some pretty positive results in the final stretch of the season. These are young guys you have to continue to foster. You can't give up on, i.e., guys like Rasmus Dahlin, who some people are saying they're going to trade him or consider trade him. That is a straight no-go for me personally, because he's too talented of a player to have another as bad a season as he had this year. But then if they can really have a good draft, put a scouting team together that they really trust, and ultimately develop their players and really sort of get a culture within their organization that helps the players understand what it means to be a quality NHL player and how they want to go about representing the Buffalo Sabres on and off the ice, I think you're going to have a lot of success getting this team turned around. They also, in terms of the coaching staff as well as the players meshing together, is going to go a long way to helping them reestablish their identity on the ice. What type of team do they want to be known as, and what type of play style do they want to define their game when they go out there and take the ice every night? Are they going to be dump and chase? Are they going to be speed and skill based? Do they want to be more defensive minded, or they want to be a team that's more carried by their offensive ability? They got to find the right players and ultimately find the right system that helps the players that they do have. So as they bring in other players to try to mesh with those players, everything sort of melds together into a perfect picture, as they say. And then ultimately, they just got to figure out first and foremost who is truly a part of their core. I mean, at the end of the day, nothing's going to be able to become successful if you don't know what players you want to go forward with. Now, with some of the young players I mentioned, like Dylan Cousins, who's one of their most recent draft picks, Middlestad, Rasmus Dahlin, who's another very, very young player that they just drafted, Asplund, and some of the other young players we got to see this year, who are really the guys they want to go forward with to be the faces of this franchise. Is Jack Eichel still going to be the face of this team, or as some rumors are beginning to swirl about now, is he going to be a guy that's on the move because of the fractured relationship between him and the organization? Are they going to keep guys like Sam Reinhart around and continue to allow them to develop and become key leaders on this franchise going forward? And what do they do with a guy like Rasmus Ristolainen, who it seems like we've been trying to trade for about three years now? So again, they really got to figure out who is the core group of players that they want to represent their team and build around going forward. And once you have that solid stability of players in place, then you can move on forward to building around those guys, putting the coach in place that can really gel with those guys. And then once you know it, you're going to have a pretty competitive or consistently competitive hockey team. And now, in terms of what my hopes are for the Buffalo Sabres, and kind of giving the fans a positive outlook of how these solutions can come about and why these solutions are possible to be done, it's because they do, I believe, have a lot of really talented young players, but they just need a set system and an assurance of direction that once you bring in a new coach that brings sort of a new voice to the locker room, I think can go a long way to help changing that. Number two, like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of good coaching options available, not just the three guys I mentioned who are some of the most notable names, but there's a lot of really good options amongst all organizations, and they just got to make sure that they do their homework and pick the right guy. And then number three, I think they got a good young goaltender who's really right in his prime in his mid-20s in Linus Ullmark. Now, he is going to need an extension this offseason with him being a free agent, but I think if they can hang on to him, especially since they don't really have anyone in their system in net that's necessarily ready to come up right away and take the league by storm, having that type of stability in net while you're trying to rebuild a franchise can be very, very key. And I think a guy like Linus Ullmark showed this past season, minus the injuries, that he can certainly handle that type of stress on his body as well as stress in front of him. So in the end, there's some positive things to look at with this Buffalo Sabres team. It's not all doom and gloom Buffalo fans, even though it seems that way right now. You just have to hope and pray that your team ultimately sort of goes about this the right way, and that ownership ultimately looks at things, has a honest assessment of themselves as well as how they run this organization, the people that work under them, and try to figure out how do we get the Buffalo Sabres back to the highs they felt a couple of decades ago. That's going to be the biggest key. But that's pretty much all I have to say on that matter, and that'll allow me to sort of wrap everything up right about now. Well, hopefully the Buffalo Sabres can right the ship, as they say. They have a lot of work to do, but I do firmly believe the pieces are in place for Buffalo to become good once again. They just have to 1. Commit to an identity, 2. Find their franchise's core, and 3. Renew their entire culture. This all sounds like much work to do, and it is for Buffalo, but for the sake of their supportive and loyal fan base, these steps must be executed properly and in good faith. Thus, that is all I have to discuss with the Sabres. Thank you all for watching and or listening, and be on the lookout for the next installment in the Run-A-Round series.